All right. Last week we were talking about the antediluvian world. We were talking about where they may have been or what we might can see in regard to how advanced they might have been, how technologically advanced they may have been. I told you last week there's some things that the Bible tells us, or some things that the Bible provides us a glimpse, and there's some things that we can draw some conclusions from. But a lot of these things, especially as we move into what we're going to talk about tonight, we want to be careful that we're not dogmatic on things that are not, absolutely the case. We're going to talk about a theory tonight, which we want to understand what that term means. Someone told me, we talked about population before the flood last week, and I was talking about around about 2 billion people on a low end number, and Chris looked up for me on his phone and found out that the last time we were at 2 billion people in this world was in the 1950s. And now here we are, how many years is that now? 73 years or whatever. We're 8 billion people, so the world has grown quite a bit, and we're actually been slowing down in growth rates over the past few years. So you can kind of see how fast a population can grow just in our most recent times. So that's something for us to take in and to consider. I always appreciate when people bring me some information. I certainly don't have access or don't always think of or know where to look for everything. So when people do that, I appreciate that. Well, we talked about the lifespan that those patriarchs there in the antediluvian period. Antediluvian is simply that time before the flood, pre-deluge, in other words. That they had these long lifespans, but that also caused them to have long learning lifespans as well, where our learning lifespans are somewhere in the 70-year range. Theirs was more than 10 times that. And so they would have been able to be a very intelligent people by the time that we reached the flood, 1,656 years after the creation of the world. I want us to consider the technology that we can see, that we can draw some conclusions from that time period. Really the first is the ark. I mean, when you consider the ark and how large that boat was and the engineering that it would have taken to build a boat, I understand that God saved Noah and them, but that doesn't preclude God using men and their engineering capabilities. You don't have to; they're not mutually exclusive things. But just the building of the ark. Do you realize that the next time in the world's history that you're going to have a boat the size of the ark is the middle of the 19th century? It's going to be 4,000 years before another boat is built on that scale. And so I think that should show us a little bit of something about the engineering involved in building a boat of that particular size at that time. And so that tells us something about the intelligence of the people of that day. Historically, we know that technology, especially engineering, was more advanced in ancient times. And then there was a period of time where technology seemed to regress, that societies didn't have the engineering skills that societies before them had. And that's almost going to take place all the way up until about the time of the Greeks, and especially the Roman Empire, where things began to really move forward again from a technological standpoint. And so we know that from a historical aspect. When you think about what took place right after the flood, the very first event that we have after the flood, after Noah and his family leave the ark, and you have a few events that take place just within their family right there. But the next major event that we see is the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. These people endeavor to build a very tall tower, and I don't think we should think that it's just, a little two-story thing. They're talking about building a tower to heaven, right? So they got a pretty big plan, don't they? It's not, and the only reason that it's not going to happen is because God intervenes. God even looks down and says, "Hey, nothing's going to stop the people from doing what they want to do here. They're going to be able to do it, so they have the engineering capability, but I'm going to stop it." Some people even think, and while this isn't about the flood, but I think it is pertinent, some people even think that effort by them, when you consider what they say, let us build a tower lest we be spread across the earth. That God has told them, He told Noah, He said, be fruitful and fill the earth, right? I want you all over the earth. And they're not moving. They're all staying together. And God's telling them to leave, and they won't. And some say that they were building that tower because they were afraid God sent another flood, and they were trying to build a building tall enough to survive it, right? Now, that's just the hubris of man, isn't it? Does anybody doubt that man wouldn't think that way? We can just circumvent God's punishment by building us a big old tower, and we can all get on top of it. That's just the way people are. So that may very well be a possible argument for that. But this takes place, the building of this tower takes place somewhere around 100 to 200 years after the flood. We look at Genesis chapter 10 and verse 25. We see that 2 sons were born to Eber. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his day the earth was divided. So when it talks about the earth being divided there, it's talking about that time in there with the Tower of Babel that God divided the peoples up among the earth based on the languages that He confused them, or that He gave each group of them, and therefore confused a group effort by having different languages. Some argue that this was the breaking up of the land bridges between the continents, and I don't have any particular problem with that per se. I'm not sure that that's really the point. It's not really, it hasn't ever been in there contextually. And we're only about 7 verses from chapter 11 and verse 1 where it says, now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. So I want you to take note there what it says, the whole earth used the same language. You drop down to verse 9 of chapter 11. It says, therefore its name was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole earth. And from there, the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. So the word earth in verse 1 is people. And the word earth, and actually in verse 9, you have both, don't you? You have earth being used in reference to people. He confused the language of the whole earth, right? And He spread them over the earth. Now that's the planet, right? Same word every time. But contextually, we come to understand what each word means. And so I think when we back up and we think about what is said as far as the dividing of the earth, we're talking about that in the days of Peleg, they built this tower. And so 100, 200 years or so based on Peleg's birth after the flood. Peleg was born 101 years after the flood, according to 10 and verse 20, and 10 and verse 25, and he lived 239 years according to chapter 11 verses in the genealogies there. 10:25 says, in his days this took place. So somewhere between 101 and 340, we'll just split the difference and go with 200. Right in there, this took place. So that's how quick they were able to do this. So certainly they were advanced in engineering. We also see as well that as we look at Ham's genealogy, Peleg and Nimrod. Nimrod is this great hunter, this great leader, and he is actually the one that began the Babylonian Empire. He began with the kingdom of Babel. He is probably the leader in this situation that's going on. They're both in the same generation. And the Bible tells us that he began Babel. And so Nimrod from Ham there, that he was that, and you see him in chapter 10 and verses 9 through 10 of Genesis, where it says he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. So if you were a strong guy, if you were a great hunter, you were like Nimrod, right? It was kind of a compliment. Now, if somebody calls you Einstein, that's probably not a compliment. I don't know why it's not. But, if somebody goes, way to go, Einstein, it usually doesn't mean you did something smart, right? But if they said you're Nimrod, then that would be exactly what they were saying, that you're a great hunter, because that's what they were saying at that time. It says the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. And the land of Shinar is simply the Fertile Crescent, if you remember your history classes, right? So he is setting up a kingdom there. It's going to also include, if you go on into the text a little further, it's also going to include the Assyrian Empire. His people are going to build the city of Nineveh that we see later on in the days of Jonah. When you think about Babel and Babylon, later Babylon and Nineveh, these cities are ancient. They go way, way back there to these original generations that came from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Well, the point I want us to make here as we think about Babel is one of the first things recorded by men is building a tower, using engineering skills. Okay, and we're going to talk about why that makes sense in just a moment. We can look in other places in history, and we can see that the Great Pyramids was built very soon after the flood as well. The father of the Egyptians was Ham's son Mizraim. Mizraim is literally the transliteration of the Hebrew word for Egypt. And so, it's not very imaginative, but we know that he is the one from which his descendants would be the nation of Egypt in the future, just as Nimrod, he's Nimrod's cousin. Their cousins would be Babylon. And that was the pyramids, the Great Pyramids of Giza. They were built within 400 years of the flood. Abraham would have seen them when he traveled down there. Remember when he lied to Pharaoh? He would have seen those pyramids. They were already built. Someone told me, I can't remember who it was, after class last week, we were talking, it might have been you, Jerry, said the pyramids were ancient when Cleopatra was walking around underneath them. They've been around a long time, even at that point. And so, as wonderful and as marvelous as those are, and we still try to figure out how they built them, right? We still don't really understand how they were able to do what they did. We have some ideas, and yet they were advanced enough to do it. And we also consider the mummification processes of the Egyptians. We still can't do it as good as they could. We still don't fully understand how they did it. There was an advanced, some advanced knowledge there. Astronomy. They were very advanced in their knowledge of astronomy. When you think about the pyramids and how they're laid out with the stars in mind. And so they had an understanding of that as well. So these things have come through. We also see that when we think about bronze and iron, according to history, the Iron Age, begins in 1200 BC. And how they make that judgment is that's when iron implements or iron replaced bronze. Okay, where people pretty much quit using bronze for things that were important and started using iron. Okay, that's how they kind of come to that Iron Age date. So that's 1200 BC. All right, when we think about that, the flood was around 2400 or 2500 rather BC. So the Iron Age begins 1300 years after the flood. Tubal-Cain was working iron at least 800 years before the flood happened. So 2,000 years previous, the world worked iron, according to the Bible, if you believe the Bible. So somebody was advanced, weren't they? And then there was a recession of that, there was a regression, rather, of that advancement. And then it was found again. And they started making iron again. But Tubal-Cain started it. It says that he worked bronze and he worked iron. One of the descendants of Cain, one of the sons of Lamech there that we talked about last week. Did Noah and his sons know how to make iron? I don't know. Doesn't sound like they might. Doesn't sound like they were real good with iron. But maybe they had a guy, right, that did their iron for them. So they didn't really understand it when they went through the flood. And that's really what we need to think about, because I want you to think about tonight, if 8 of us in this room were the only people to survive a world cataclysm, what is lost to our world? A whole bunch, right? Now, I know about nuclear stuff, right? Couldn't build a nuclear reactor. I know about cars. I've worked on my car. I've worked on cars, but you know what? I couldn't build a car. I don't know how to do metallurgy like Jerry. I'd have to be able to work metals, right, to even build a car. It's not just about having an engine. You got to make the stuff to make the engine. And so there's a lot of knowledge that's lost, right? Only what we know personally, each of us. Aaron, we want you because you're a doctor. We need that medical knowledge. Only what we know is going to come through and be where we start on the other side. And so it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? That engineering is what's on the other side of the flood. Because that's what Noah and his sons knew. They knew engineering. They built an ark, that enormous boat, right? They understood something about engineering, something about how to build things. And so that's what we see. There seems to be some other things that went through. How that is, we don't know. But, these are things that we have very shortly after the flood, and then we don't have them. And then they come back, and we have them later. So we see this idea here that what comes through the flood is these engineering things. They're building towers. They're building pyramids. That's what they're building. Because that's what the knowledge is that they probably had most of after the flood, when 8 people brought what they knew through the flood and everybody else died. So we can just imagine how that would be. And that's how it was for them. Well, yes, sir.
The Aztecs built in southern South America.
Yes, sir.
Okay? And the pyramids were built in Africa and almost on the same.
Yeah, it is interesting that you can look through different cultures and you do find that there's some similarity in some architectures. And you wonder if that wasn't something that goes all the way back to when people were doing, what people knew from that point forward. Because, like you say, there's pyramids over here, there's pyramids over there. That idea came from somewhere. Yes, yeah, and we'll talk about that when we get over to the flood itself. My family is upset at me because I told them I might not actually get to the flood tonight. I was like, 5 weeks. I told Cody. He said, I just want you to get to the flood before Steve starts teaching. I said, well, I'll probably go, and God's going to destroy the world with the flood, but it's Steve's week. Next week, I'm done. Hopefully that won't be the case. It's hard for us to know how advanced they were before the flood, because the flood really left little to nothing of the world that was. When we talk about the flood, when we study it, we're going to see that even the Bible tells us that the flood was a tidal event. That not only was it just standing water, but it's moving water. And there's nothing more destructive, more corrosive than masses of moving water. Did anybody see that video on the news of that house getting washed into the river? Water will rapidly change the face of the environment that it's upon if it's running swiftly. As Peter stated, all those things were destroyed. And there are some massive ruins that have been found deep beneath the ocean, which might just be a remnant, but we don't know. Unfortunately, those who study such things do not regard the flood as a possibility. And so you're always going to get some other line of reasoning that they might have. And it would be very hard to deny that the antediluvian people were quite advanced, especially at least from an engineering standpoint. But I want us to consider how much advancement has happened in our world since 367 AD. Does anybody want to go back and live in 367 AD? You like the world you live in today? I mean, we're back in the Roman Empire, right? Well, 367 AD to today is exactly how long it was between creation and the flood. How much have we advanced in those numbers of years, right? And so, there is an idea for us to consider. I want us to also think about the environment of the world at that time. Why did the people before the flood live so much longer than after? Why, as the Bible tells us, are our years 70 years, right? And 80th by strength, right? Why was it 900 in their days plus 908 on average based on what we talked about last week? It is very possible that the explanation for their longevity is found in the environment that existed in the world before the flood. And it's interesting that the same thing that creates that environment is the very mechanism, if it is the case, that God could use to bring the flood itself. So the very death that was wrought upon that world was the very thing that gave life, long life, maybe to the people that lived. There's some irony there. But is there an environmental mechanism that is possibly the cause of that world as seen in Scripture? Well, we go back to Genesis chapter 1 and verses 6. That says 6 through 8. I think it's just 6 through 7. But it is day 2 of creation. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below from the expanse from the water below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. And it was so. Now at this time there's no land yet. The earth is simply covered with water, and we won't have dry land until the next day, but the waters on the earth were divided. And in that division, it created an expanse, it says. The expanse is the sky. It's where the birds fly. We see that in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 20. He created birds to fly in the expanse, right? So the Bible defines itself. We don't have to wring our hands on all these things. So the expanse that he's talking about here is the skies, and so there were waters which were below. Well, that's the waters that are covering the earth underneath the skies. But then he says that he put waters above the expanse, right? That there was waters that he put above there, and that would certainly be the atmosphere. While I believe that this particular theory that we're going to talk about is to be plausible and even likely, it is a theory, and therefore it is not something empirically proven. And that's the same as evolution, folks. I don't care what they say. It's a theory because you can't empirically prove it. They can't reproduce it in a laboratory. Their own standards say they can't do that. And so it's a theory. And this is a theory. It can't reproduce the vapor canopy that the world lived under, if that was the case at that particular time. So it's a theory and nothing more. The Bible doesn't tell us specifically that this is the case. We just draw evidences from it, and we can draw, I think, some logical conclusions that might be true. I want us to be honest with that, though. So there's waters above the expanse could mean nothing more. I want to be honest with this too. Could mean nothing more than the atmosphere, period. What makes the atmosphere? Moisture. Now, we could use a little more atmosphere over us, couldn't we? A little more moisture, get some water raining down on us right now. But the atmosphere is moisture. And so it could be nothing more than that, but it doesn't seem to be just that. There seems to be something very unique being talked about here. Waters. It seems to be almost comparable to the waters in the ocean that are the waters on the earth at that time, and there's waters above. The two seem to be almost synonymous with each other, and so there seems to be something greater than what we might deal with today. It may be speaking of a greater amount of water in the atmosphere that was at the beginning than we have in our atmosphere today. We know that it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, right? All of our children could tell us that. Rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Well, that's a lot of water. And at 100% humidity, you have almost zero evaporation rates. When it's raining, it's not evaporating. And so, you're at a point where the dew point doesn't allow that to happen. So if it's raining, it's not just reprocessing the water for 40 days. There's 40 days of rain, emptying out of the atmosphere. If all of our atmospheric water today poured down in a rain all over the earth, our atmosphere would be dry in less than an afternoon. That's how little moisture is actually in the atmosphere of our world today. It wouldn't take long to drain it out if it was raining all over the earth, the universal rain. No one should ignore that God could have miraculously interfered with natural laws to cause this much rain. We're never going to ever deny that. That's always the possibility, right? We don't ever take God out of the equation, but God is a God that uses natural processes at times, and so it's something for us to consider. Yes, I saw a hand. Yes, sir.
Might remember that the atmosphere has a number of layers.
Sure.
There should be different parts of it, so this could possibly fit that because there would be layers high, medium, and low.
Yeah. Well, I think if you're thinking about a whole lot more moisture in the air, let's just say that you have the physical amount of moisture in the atmosphere, and that's really what we're talking about here. What's called the vapor canopy theory. that if you have enough moisture in the atmosphere to rain for 40 days, okay, through natural processes, then you're going to have a much denser atmosphere than we have today. And there's some things that are going to come about as a result of that. And it's going to at least provide possible explanations for things that we ask questions about a lot of times in regard to the environment of that time. First thing that you're going to see, if that was the case, if you had this vapor canopy, this thicker atmosphere around us filled with water, enough water for 40 days of rain, universal rain, then one thing you're going to have is a constant and temperate climate throughout all the earth. One of the things that as I study this and I consider these things, I think about God looking at His creation saying, it is good. Very good, right? Let me tell you what, the world they got to live in, if this is the case, is a very good place to live. I hear people today go, folks, I've been in a town hit by an F4 tornado. I've been in a town with 1,000-year flood. I've seen, natural disasters, and I've had people ask, why does God let this happen? Let me tell you, God may not have ever designed it to be that way. But the flood may be the cataclysm that caused those things to come about. And what caused the flood? Sin. It ain't God's fault, if that's the case. It's not God's fault anyway. Well, it would have had a constant and temperate climate throughout the world, subtropical and tropical, 75 degrees plus. There wouldn't, such a condition would eliminate high winds. It would eliminate a lot of atmospheric disturbances. You'd still have seasons, but they wouldn't be dramatic. I don't think you'd have 112 degree heat and then ice storms in the winter. They're seasons, but they're not dramatic seasons like we experience today. And you want to know who also will tell you this? You're going, Nathan, yeah, but you believe in the Bible. And you're looking at the Bible and you're drawing conclusions from that. Well, then let's draw a conclusion from an evolutionist, a person who doesn't care one thing about the Bible. Listen to what he says. The warm, equitable climate characteristic of the entire Cretaceous period prevailed almost over most of the world throughout the Jurassic, with possible localized exceptions. The universal tropicality is difficult to explain. That's an evolutionary scientist trying to explain evidence for universal tropicality on this earth at one point. That's not a Bible guy. That's science. Now they don't like what it says, right? They can't explain what it says because they don't want to certainly acknowledge anything about God or what the Bible has said. Another evolutionist named Markel summarized the Jurassic era, and he said a fairly rich flora of temperate species flourished within or near both the Arctic and Antarctic circles in East Greenland and Greenland. Did you hear what he just said? Even in the North Pole areas, Greenland, and those areas, he says that there was a rich flora of plants. On Axel Heiberg Island, the same evolutionist states this. He says the forests there are mummified. The wood is dry and somewhat compressed, but otherwise unchanged, with many trees reaching more than 100 feet in height. These are big trees. I lived in Abilene. There's only 2 trees in the city of Abilene that I know of that are probably that tall. Okay, everything else is mesquite. And the 2 trees is two ladies and members of the church. They live in this house, and they live right on top of an aquifer. And they planted 2 oak trees out there, and they tapped right into that aquifer, and they grew up. But that's the only trees you're going to find in Abilene, right? But here we are on this island. Axel Heiberg Island is only 680 miles from the North Pole. And it has trees, petrified trees that were over 100 feet high. And that's a picture of one of the fossilized trees there that were found. Palm trees are found buried in ice and petrified forest in Antarctica. Massive coal deposits indicate large amounts of vegetation at one time hard frozen in Arctic areas. Flash frozen mammoths and elephants in Siberia that have fresh flowers still found in their mouths. and frozen so perfectly. Now guess who studies them? Sara Lee. Frozen foods? Because dog sled guys will still take flesh off of them, had been taking flesh off of them, feeding them to their dogs. It was that good still to be used. And yet they had been dead for many centuries. You know, creation scientists Wickham and Morris suggested the most immediate and obvious of these effects would be to cause a uniformly temperate climate around the earth. Such water vapor as is present in the atmosphere today has the specific effect of regulating the Earth's temperature. Isn't that what we always hear about climate change and global warming? That we're putting stuff in the atmosphere? The atmosphere does have something to do with temperature. But listen to what he says. He says, such water vapor as is present in the atmosphere today has the specific effect of regulating the Earth's temperature. The inferred antediluvian vapor envelope would have produced this result in a much greater degree, with a larger percentage of the sun's incoming radiant energy being absorbed and retained and uniformly distributed over the earth than at present. Both seasonally and latitudinally, the constant battle of fronts would be almost absent, so the antediluvian climates were not only warm, but also without violent storms, windstorms. Such an environment would have slight air currents, but no extreme weather. So, as we mentioned a moment ago, storms and all that might be a product of what man has done as he ruined God's very good creation by his actions. Oh, and those dinosaurs. Can't ever leave out dinosaurs, can we? I can't tell you how many people ask me about dinosaurs. Anytime you talk about the ark, but there are dinosaurs on the ark? Yes, there were. We'll talk more about that. But think about the dinosaurs with this. What are most reptiles? Cold-blooded? What kind of world does a dinosaur thrive in? A world that's temperate. Cold-blooded animals don't like hot. They don't like cold. They need kind of a temperate world, don't they? So they're going to thrive in this kind of world. You know, some Christians have denied dinosaurs. Please don't do that. There is no denying dinosaurs. They are real. I have walked in the Rocky Mountains, and I have seen their footprints, places in rock that no man could have put them there, okay? They're real. They walked on this earth at one point. And so we don't want to deny that. We don't want to, because that truly would be something that would be erroneous. This world was perfect for them, and the flood changed all that. Yeah, I believe that many of the dinosaurs are gone because of a catastrophe, but it wasn't an asteroid. It was the flood that God brought upon this earth. That was the catastrophe. Catastrophism is something that the earth shows. That's why they've got to find a catastrophe to fit, but not the Bible one. And so we hear that all the time in science. You know, at that particular time, in this particular weather, you'd have an extraordinary amount. We're going to talk about another reason why you would too. But you'd have an extraordinary amount of vegetation. Who thinks you're going to need a lot of vegetation? How about an elephant? 8 to 10 tons. I've actually seen one. What would you call it? He was trying to protect his baby. We didn't know it. We were in a safari car. And he's in the road. He's got his ears flailed. And he's out in the. I mean, he's a scary thing. I asked my God. I said, "What are we going to do if he attacks us?" He said, "We're probably going to die." Thanks God, that really made me feel good. He said he'll kick us around like a tin can. He said this truck's nothing to him. Elephants 8 to 10 tons. They eat 400 pounds of food a day. How much do you think the Argentinosaurus at 40 to 50 tons eats every single day? And he's massively larger than an elephant. You know, you're going to have a world that has a lot of vegetation to feed him, and well, we could just keep putting slides of dinosaurs up there. They're bigger than elephants, and talk about that. Well, this also fits with the belief that we have at times that it having not rained before the flood. Genesis chapter 2 and verses 5 through 6 say, Now no shrub of the field was yet in the earth, and no plant of the field had yet sprouted, for the Lord had not sent rain upon the earth, and there was no man to cultivate the ground, but a mist used to rise up from the earth and water the whole surface of the ground. Now mist here, that's probably an odd translation. It's not real great. It's actually a flow. Almost like a thought of water just kind of bubbling up out of the ground and kind of flowing around. That's kind of what was going on here, that God was irrigating from underground water sources instead of from the rain. And when he talks about no shrubs had sprouted yet, well, God's already created plant life. But what it's talking about here is that which is cultivated by man. In other words, man hasn't started planting crops. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden weren't told to go plant their food, were they? Eat of what? Every tree in the garden except, right? So they had food provided for them. But now, after the sin, right, then God says, well, now you're going to have to work by the toil of your brow, the sweat of your brow. You're going to have to toil for your food. So there's going to come a time when that's going to be a reality. So based on this verse, there is a line of reasoning here that would say that it didn't rain before the flood. And that would fit what we read in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7, where it says, by faith. What is faith? Somebody tell me what faith is, according to Hebrews. Yeah. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. Okay? So it's going to almost be the same definition in this verse right here. It says, being warned by God about things not yet seen, in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. So some have argued that this can mean rain, and that certainly could be the case, right? God told him it was going to rain. God told him it was going to be a flood. Now, I could also make an argument, and I try to present every side of these things. I could make an argument that a global flood period is something that was never seen. Okay, so you could just break it down to that. It doesn't necessarily have to be just rain. But, there were things that God told Noah that Noah had to take on faith. If you told me it was going to rain today, I'd go, yeah, I get it. I know what rain is. I've seen it, right? I know how much it can rain at times. And, I'd have a grasp of it, right? But if you're Noah, let's say you've lived 500 years, you've never seen a raindrop, that's a heady thing to get your mind around, right? It's going to rain. What is that? Well, water's going to fall out of the sky. I don't get that. Now we're operating on faith, right? Things not seen. Will you just do what God says, even though it might sound ridiculous to you, right? And so by faith, Noah did these things. Well, the vapor canopy theory could produce an atmosphere where there is no rainfall. Remember what I told you about? There's not competing fronts going back and forth. And the things that oftentimes cause our rain. Well, another thing, I'm definitely, Jenny, not going to get to the flood tonight. Another thing that we could see as an effect from the vapor canopy is an increased air pressure across the earth. Hyperbaric chambers are used today to increase pressure for burn victims, for healing. It increases healing, and to help people with other injuries and even eye issues. There's a lot of different things that can be dealt with. I wouldn't want to get into try to even get into a deep conversation on that, but a vapor canopy, as we have been discussing, would create a thicker atmosphere and increase the general air pressure and oxygen percentage above that which we experience in our world today. Now, that sounds all like a bunch of words. What does that mean, right? What kind of impact does that have? The use of such chambers today, we need to also understand there are problems with two things: compression and decompression. For this class, I decided to go look at the Mayo Clinic's things that can go, not good for you using hyperbaric chambers. Your lungs can collapse from the pressure change. Your eardrums can burst from pressure change. So some of the dangers in it is compression and decompression. What do divers have to do when they dive really deep and come back up? They have to decompress, right? They get compressed. Nitrogen molecules can then expand and create what's called the bends, cause you to have, it's deadly. And so they might spend a certain amount of time in a decompression chamber while they're brought up slowly back to the pressure that is the norm. And so our bodies are acclimated to the pressures that we live under, that we're literally born into. It is different if one is born in other conditions. And experiments with animals born and raised in such conditions have created some interesting results. One of the more interesting to me, at any rate, experiments found that a copperhead snake's venom, when it is born and raised in a higher pressure, air pressure and oxygen rate, changes in its chemical composition and is no longer poisonous. And so, we don't understand all that's behind that. But it does show that there are some things that would be different maybe. Genesis chapter 11, verses 10 through 32 show us the generations from Shem to Abram. Shem was born before the flood. He was born in the 502nd year of Noah's life. 98 years before the flood came, Shem was born. And only 2 of the 9 generations between Shem and Abraham will outlive him. Those 2 are Eber, I mentioned him a while ago with Peleg. Eber, who was his great-great-grandson, he will just barely outlive him. And the other one is 7 great-grandson Abraham. He'll outlive him. 2 out of 9. That's how fast the age, people's, life expectancy dropped after the flood, while Shem's remained quite high, and Noah's as well. We don't have the dates on Ham or Japheth, but we do for Shem and for Noah. Look at this chart, and I think you can kind of see it. Okay, you got to ignore Enoch. He doesn't count. We talked about that last week because God took him. He intervened. But look at how long everybody lives. The red line's the flood. That last line that the flood's cutting through, that's Shem. And then everybody else is born after the flood. And look at the drop and how long they're living. And they're not having kids anymore at 500 years old. They're not even getting there, for that matter. In fact, by the time you get to Abraham, he thinks at the age of 100 that he's too old to have children, right? Remember? And him nor Sarah. And so we can see that there is a common denominator here between long lifespans and short lifespans, and what sits in between them and where the dividing line is the flood. So it stands reasonably logical, doesn't it? That something changed. Something changed in the world that made that the case. But not for those that lived, those that were before the flood seem to still hold some of whatever the vitality was that they had before, because Noah will live 350 years after the flood. He'll get right up to Abraham. And Shem will live all the way to the days of Isaac. And see grandson, great-great-grandson, great-great-great-great-grandson, great-great-great-great-great die of old age. Something changed. And that's beyond contestation. What it is and how it is, that's where we have to wonder sometimes. When we think about pressure issues, I told you that the problems with hyperbaric chambers was decompression and pressure. Noah and his family also had time to adjust to the decrease in pressure. So the deeper you go, right, into the ocean as a diver, the longer you have to spend in the decompression chamber, right? So that you don't have adverse effects. 40 days it rains. And the very thing that causes the pressure, the air pressure on the earth, is the moisture in the atmosphere. And as it rains, it thins. And as it thins, the pressure lowers. And so the 40 days on the ark could have been simply 40 days of decompression for Noah and his family as they slowly came down to the air pressure that we know today. Not the air pressure that evolutionary scientists have already found to be the case in their studies. A much higher pressure than today, 2 times at least. And so that makes a lot of sense. It's something for us to certainly consider and to think about. Well, as I mentioned to you, scientists say that it was 2 to 2.5 times air pressure above what we have today. Evolutionary scientists acknowledge this reality. Gary Landis of the U.S. Geological Survey, he's an evolutionist, by the way, he said measured oxygen in microscopic air bubbles. They find them in that amber. If you watch Jurassic Park, right, you know what amber is. They find the little air bubbles in the amber. And then they'll put something in there and they'll draw that out so they can do tests on it and kind of find out some things about the atmosphere of that time. But he studied those. And he found that the amount of oxygen dropped from 35% 2 million years, and that's his numbers. 35% 2 million years before the end of the Cretaceous period. Today, the oxygen level is somewhere around 21%. That's their studies. It just fits. I don't ever worry about... I don't think the Bible and science are in competition with each other. I don't think they're in a fight with each other. I think there's lies out there that we're in a fight with. But if we really are seeking truth as science is supposed to be, it's never going to have a problem with the truth, right? I love science. I love astronomy. I love to go out and look at the stars in a telescope. And and I read those books, and I kind of just like I just mentioned to you a while ago. That's their date. I don't take it as my dating, but I don't really have a problem with the Bible or the science that I love, and because the two are not in contradiction with each other. It's just men and what men have decided to make things that really are not, and to deceive people in various ways. Well, this higher air pressure that Gary Landis here talks about would have led to accelerated healing and health. It could be the reason for those extreme lifespans of the antediluvian people. And the Bible's not the only place that talks about people that lived a long time before the flood. Babylonians, they had a flood epic. They had a story about the flood too. In fact, if you go back in a lot of ancient civilizations, they have a flood epic. I mean, you don't have to just go to the Bible to hear some civilization talking about the flood. Indians in South America have the one that they hollowed out a tree trunk and stayed in it and wrote out the flood. And so Babylonians had their epic of the flood, but they also, when they talked about that, they talked about the world before, and they said the kings of that time lived 20,000 years. That's a little bit of hyperbole, right? It's a little exaggerated for people saying they lived a long time, right? So even they talk about it. Even they talk about it before Moses wrote it in the Bible. It was a thing. And so, I don't ever have any doubts about how long those guys lived. There are some people that want to say, well, those years are actually months. John Clayton's one of those. Folks, if that's the case, Enoch had Methuselah at 5.5 years old. That's just kind of strange. I don't think we want that. It's not months, it's years. And the Bible didn't suddenly switch to years after the flood. That wouldn't make any sense either. Another real quick, we got about 4 minutes. Another interesting thing is that, I have not kept up with my pushing the button. Another interesting thing is that fermentation is almost non-existent in this environment because of the O2, or the oxygen levels that exist. The yeast does not function in the same way in this type of environment. They've put it in there. They've put it in these chambers, and they've watched how it interacts, and it won't interact like it does in our atmosphere. And so when we look at chapter 9, And we see Noah plant a vineyard and begin to drink, and he drank and he got drunk and he stripped off his clothes, right, and ended up embarrassing himself in front of his sons. I don't know that we should be too disparaging on Noah. He may not have had any idea of how the world had changed, how yeast works now in the fermentation process compared to how it worked before, in a much higher level of oxygen and pressure. This same principle also is applied to microorganisms, which then we draw the conclusion that if microorganisms were different, disease and a lot of other things would not have flourished in that time either. It may have, they found even that some seem to even take on different effects as a result of being in these type of environments. We've got 2 minutes, but I will talk just a little bit about what we'll finish up with next week, and then we will begin to get to the flood. Dinosaurs, again, coming back to the big dinosaurs. Reptiles grow for as long as they what? I wished I would have grown as long as I lived. Right? Maybe I wouldn't be 5'9". I'd be like 6'5", or something bigger. I'm not fat. I'm just under tall. Y'all just don't know that. Reptiles grow as long as they live. If people are living 900 years, how long is the iguana living? How long are other reptiles living and continuing to grow year after year after year after year in an environment of incredible oxygen diffusion? And that's really what determines the size of something. How big can you be and still have an oxygen diffusion level to allow for life? Right? The Argentinosaurus I showed you, he really couldn't survive very long in our time because of the oxygen diffusion levels. He wouldn't get enough. He would never grow to be that big. He would die long before that happened. But he would just stop growing at a point where his body could no longer fuel that growth through oxygen diffusion. And so, it has been made clear even in the scientific evolutionary world that those kind of things play into this. They cause gigantism in organisms. The largest of dinosaurs could only exist in this type of environment without some unknown means of surviving it without such. And so we'll talk just a little bit more about that and some other things about the dinosaurs that apply to this, and then we will get to what God said about mankind. Appreciate your good attention. Let's conclude with a prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your word. We thank you that it has all truth, Father, and we pray that we apply ourselves to it, Father, and we pray that we look at it honestly and that we hold to those things that are doctrine to be true, to always hold to those things and to never yield, but to also know that some things are the things of opinion, and that we will exercise love and an understanding in those things. Father, we pray that you go with us now and that you bless us. We pray these things in Christ Jesus' name.